Jeremy and perhaps some of the others of you mentioned the environment during that answer, so we'll take an environmental question now. This is from Cathy Smythe.
Good evening, everybody, and on behalf of Guildford and Waverley Friends of the Earth and all environmental organisations, we are all concerned that climate change has slipped down the list of priorities in the face of the recession. How will the candidates ensure it is given the importance and priority it requires?
Roger. Yes, I think so. Coming back this way.
Party I support, this is really in a way a question about nuclear power, because the cause of most of the global warming and the overheating is population, isn't it? It's the population of the Earth that is increasing and increasing to the degree that we can't support it on. Somebody said once that to support the entire human race at the standard of living that we enjoy, we'd need 3 planets. We haven't got 3 planets, we've only got 1. So the problem is, how do we generate enough energy in a way that we can do it without damaging the environment? And that, to me and to my party, comes back to nuclear power. So we are pro-nuclear. I know I've heard all the arguments about security, but nuclear doesn't do any harm to the environment as long as it's safely controlled. Yeah? And that's the position that we stand in. We also believe in clean coal, where we capture the CO2, and we need to develop those technologies because both India and China have something like 100 years of coal in the ground, and they're going to dig it out. They're definitely going to use it, but we need to export to them the technology that will be able to do that safely. So from my point of view, it's clean coal and nuclear, and that's UKIP's position.
Luke.
I think this is a global responsibility. Now, we're coming up to what we know as 2012. The communication across the world that we've got, the internet, we can find out from our neighbours across the world what works. And what seems to be working is now, I think, who listens to the Archers? Right? They're moaning, my mum would say. They've gone transition town, all right? And if you're looking in Japan, there are 70, or I think it's 90 towns in Japan have gone transition town. Look it up, all right? I won't get into details about it, all right? And there are towns across the UK, all right, that are doing the same. It's mostly in the rural areas first, all right? So look that up, and I think that will help us to reduce. I think it's about creating local communities to reduce your carbon emissions.
Thank you. Cathy, I'm actually not quite as pessimistic as you about climate change on the political agenda, because I think it is one of the things that could have fallen victim to the recession, general election, but actually it hasn't. And what happened was that, I mean, from the Conservative point of view, the party that might have been expected to be most sceptical. So incidentally, I have to say that I am a big supporter of the idea that we do need to act about climate change. My father, who is over here, is a great climate change skeptic, so I get this debate every Sunday lunch. So here's a chance to tell you again, Dad, that I do actually think that the only sensible thing for politicians to do is to respect the overwhelming majority of scientific advice, which suggests that our climate is at real risk of going over a tipping point if we allow global temperatures to rise by another 2 degrees. And there is an argument that needs to be won again after the failure of the Copenhagen Treaty, after the issues at the University of East Anglia and so on. But I think the really important point is that the Conservatives, led by David Cameron, who is very committed on climate change, and the Liberal Democrats persuaded the government eventually to have a Climate Change Act which commits the government of this country to legally binding emissions reductions on a 5-yearly basis. And the question now is how we implement that. And I think there are some very important things that we need to do. First of all, we need to change the way air travel is taxed. I think a lot of people have been wondering over the last few days whether the glorious blue skies are anything to do with the fact that there have been no planes in them. But thankfully for the people who are stranded, that's now started to stop. But the truth is, at the moment, we have a levy on individual passengers rather than a levy on a whole plane basis. And that doesn't encourage airlines to fill their planes. That needs to change. We also need, once and for all, to make this shift towards rail travel in this country instead of dependence on the car. And that's why the Conservatives have proposed a high-speed rail network. Now, I lived in Japan for a couple of years, and I've seen how having a really good high-speed rail network actually transforms a society. It helps people get around a lot more easily. It creates millions of jobs. But it's a difficult thing to make happen, and it needs real determination. There are very complex planning issues, but I think once and for all saying that we can avoid the need for another runway at Heathrow if we have a proper high-speed rail network that means people can travel around the country by train is something that we definitely need to do. And finally, we need incentives to get people to insulate their homes better. And we proposed a scheme whereby the cost of insulation in the home could be met by the reductions in fuel bills that you get from doing it over the subsequent 10, 15, 20 years. And so I think it's a whole range of things like that. But just to reassure you, Cathy, if the Conservatives win the next election, we are absolutely committed to making sure that Britain leads the way in terms of our responsibilities for climate change. Because the reality is that if countries like Britain don't set an example, how are we ever going to persuade the newly industrialised countries like China and India that they need to do something as well?
Sorry, can we move on to Mike's reply?
This chap saying it was hot in January, so it can't be true. Now, I can say that the Liberal Democrats have this as a very high priority, and if you look at our manifesto online, you'll see that we've got some radical proposals on how to address this. Similar ideas to the Conservatives, but actually we're putting a lot more beef behind it. And if we take the issue of housing, it's 27% of CO2 emissions that are emitted by our homes. So there's a fantastic opportunity. In Germany, they are retrofitting every single house. They're investing a huge amount of money, but they reckon they're going to get back €6 in savings eventually for every €1 invested, in terms of making their homes much more energy efficient. And there's lots of ways of doing that. We know many of them. And also in encouraging micro-generation. But another aspect of our policy is that we would set up, under the leadership of Vince Cable as Chancellor, we hope, a national investment bank which would channel a lot of funding into alternative energy, into renewable energy. And we would not favour nuclear energy. The reason for that is because of the astronomical costs involved, especially in terms of the clean-up. And then you've got the half-life of all the particles, etc. So you're looking at a very long-term strategy if you think that we can solve the issue with nuclear energy. And likewise, we would not be supporting any more coal-fired stations unless there was carbon capture effectively done. So what we're looking at principally is offshore and marine generation to a large extent. We will put a huge amount of money into northern shipyards in order to turn them into the facilities to create these turbines and so on for that renewable energy setup, as I say, marine and offshore. So there's lots of things. You can read a lot more detail in our manifesto, but our programme, short of perhaps the Green Party, is the most radical on these issues. Thank you very much.